First of all, let me just start by saying thanks for coming. It's Friday afternoon, and it's a beautiful fall day out there, and I imagine that for a lot of folks, there are a lot of other things they could be up to, but I appreciate you spending a few minutes with me. What I thought I might do is just chat for about 20 minutes about my background and why I'm doing this, and then just open it up to questions, and you can feel free to ask me about pretty much anything. I'm 53, I'm a Massachusetts kid. I've lived here for about 46 of those 53 years. I grew up in Needham, Massachusetts, went to schools there. The product of what I call a mixed marriage. My mom's a Democrat, my dad's a Republican. And I learned a lot from that growing up because they used to argue about pretty much all things, policy and political. And I learned that you can disagree without being disagreeable. They've been married for 55 years, and this will probably be the first election they've ever voted for the same person, which is a little bit of a milestone in our household. Although my mom, we're still not really sure. And the second thing I learned, which was equally important, is competition in policy and politics is just like competition in everything else. It's a good thing. Listening to my parents debate the issues of the day growing up was healthy because neither one of them came at it the same way, and they both made the other work a lot harder when they would talk about whatever it was that was sort of on the front page of the paper or on the evening news. And as a kid, you really learn to appreciate the fact that there's more than one point of view on most issues, and that listening to the two of them hash it out was something that I found to be particularly sort of fascinating and had a lot to do with the way I got interested in public policy and with politics in the first place. I did end up going into state government in the early 1990s. I helped start an organization called the Pioneer Institute, which was a research organization. It was founded by an older fella who was retired, but we created this independent think tank to study state policy issues, and that was how I got to know then a candidate for governor, Bill Weld, who was running for governor. We'd done a lot of work in the education space, and Pioneer actually was sort of the birth parent of the charter school movement in Massachusetts. But we'd also done some stuff in healthcare, and that was how I got to know Bill. And when he won, he asked me if I'd come work in his administration as Undersecretary at Health and Human Services. And I was about 31 years old, and the state had a 9% unemployment rate, which is about what it is now. The budget deficit was $1 billion, only then the budget was only $13 billion. Now it's about $30 billion, but it's a $2 billion budget deficit. The S&L crisis was in full bloom. Nobody could borrow any money. People were sort of really worried about where the state was heading, and I figured, what the heck, this is sort of a chance for me to try to see if I could sort of toss my oar into the water and get something done. So I took the job, and I ended up spending 8 years in state government, 2 as Undersecretary at Health and Human Services, and then 2 as Secretary of Health and Human Services, and then 4 years in Administration and Finance. And over that period of time, we did get a lot of stuff done, and I would argue part of the reason for that was because we did have both teams on the field. There was this back and forth that took place between the Republican administration and the Democratic legislature, and whether it was workers' comp reform, or welfare reform, or healthcare reform, or criminal justice reform, or education reform, there was this sort of pull and tug that took place between us and them on a lot of the issues that we were debating, and I think in the end we got better products, better legislation, better policy as a result of that back and forth during that period of time. And the best part of all was we did rein in the budget deficit. By the time I left state government in 1998, that $1 billion deficit was actually a $1 billion surplus. And the best part was Massachusetts had really grown jobs. Over that period, the state generated about 400,000 jobs on a net basis, which meant our unemployment rate, which was 9% in 1991, which was 2 points above the national average, dropped down to about 3% in 1998, which was 2 points below the national average. And it's still the only period in the last 30 years where on a sustained basis, the Massachusetts economy outperformed the national economy. And I left there feeling pretty good about what we'd accomplished, because we'd walked into something that was pretty dysfunctional and mostly bankrupt. I mean, the state's bond rating at that point was just 1 grade above junk. And over the course of the next 8 years, we got a lot of good work done. People were, we had a good working relationship with the legislature, a good working relationship with the cities and towns, a good working relationship with a lot of the folks that the state was sort of engaged with and involved with. And most important of all was the fiscal piece was completely under control. We had a lot of credibility with a lot of the people who did business with the state relative to that. And we grew the economy and got people back to work, which had been the fundamental objective of a lot of what we've been doing since we got there. And when I left to go work for Harvard Vanguard Medical Associates, I thought I was leaving to go work for a physicians group, and that was what I was intending to do. But shortly after I got to Harvard Vanguard Medical Associates, Harvard Pilgrim, which was the insurance company that was the parent company of the physician group, fired their CEO and their CFO and reported a $100 million loss, operating loss. This was 1998. And some of the members of the board showed up in my office and said, we'd really like you to be the CEO of Harvard Pilgrim. And I said, well, you know, I kind of got the job I want. I mean, I want to run the physician group. I'm really not all that interested in this particular job. And they said, well, we'd really like you to consider it. And I said, no, I don't really want to do that job. And they left. And then they came back a couple weeks later and they said, you know, nobody really wants this job. And we don't really have a lot of time, and we don't have a lot of money. And by the way, if Harvard Pilgrim fails, the physician group's going to fail too, because the physician group is tied to Harvard Pilgrim. So we think our interests are aligned on this, and you ought to reconsider our offer. And I said, well, if you're going to put it like that, I guess I don't have a lot of choice. And I sort of reluctantly took the job at Harvard Pilgrim. And it turned out that, you know, it was pretty bad. I mean, Harvard Pilgrim was in terrible shape financially at that time. And that first year that I was there for the last 6 months, the plan lost $225 million to go along with the $100 million they lost the year before. They ended up in receivership, which is sort of the insurance version of bankruptcy. And most people thought the plan was simply going to go away. But we did have that little window there in the last 6 months of the previous year where we'd sort of done a diagnostic on what was wrong, we put together a plan, and we started to implement it. And over the course of the next couple of years, with some help from the Attorney General's office, who basically oversaw that receivership, we implemented a big piece of that plan and sort of righted the fiscal ship of the organization, dug it out of the hole that we were in, and we only lost $10 million the next year, which was a huge improvement over the previous year. And then eventually started to focus on the stuff we wanted to focus on, which was creating a really good member experience, working to improve the quality of the service we were providing, and working to establish a much better relationship with the physicians and hospitals that we were working with. And that was what led to the plan being ranked the #1 health plan in the country for 5 years in a row for member satisfaction and clinical effectiveness. And so I would have stayed there, and I think been pretty happy to stay there if I felt like the state was heading in the right direction. But over the course of the past couple of years, I grew increasingly concerned about whether or not the state, under Governor Patrick's leadership, was going to be able to balance the state's budget, was going to be able to dig its way out of the fiscal crisis that we found ourselves in, and create a climate and an environment where we could get all those people who are out of work back to work. And eventually, I decided that I didn't think they would, and that was why I got into the race. I left Harvard Pilgrim in July of 2009, and jumped into the governor's race, and spent the last 15 months working this. And it's kind of interesting to have been at this now for 15 months and to have 11 days to go. I mean, it's sort of like, you know, swimming across the ocean, and you go a very long time where you can't see land in either direction, and then all of a sudden, there it is. It's right out there. It's only 11 days away. And I feel that what's interesting is I got into it specifically because I was concerned about what I call the pocketbook stuff, jobs, taxes, and spending. And here we are, 11 days away from the election, and it's still about jobs, taxes, and spending. I mean, those are the issues over and over again that I hear when I'm out there on the campaign trail. When I'm talking to folks about what's sort of fundamentally on their mind, what they're particularly worried about, people are worried about, they're worried about the economy. They're worried about their job. They're worried about their spouse's job. They're worried about getting a job. They're worried about keeping a job. I mean, the level of anxiety on this it permeates sort of all regions of Massachusetts, almost every industry cluster you can think of, almost every single line of work you could come up with. That is fundamentally what's on most people's minds, which is, am I going to be able to get a job? Am I going to be able to keep a job? Am I going to be able to pay my bills? Am I going to be able to keep a roof over my head, over the head of my family? That's what's on people's minds. And right behind that is, what's the state doing to live within its means? What's the state doing to create a climate for jobs? What's the state doing to get people back to work? And what's the state doing with regard to tax policy, fiscal policy, and the decisions the state makes that fundamentally affect either my ability to keep a job, get a job, or pay my bills. And, and as somebody who got into this race thinking that was sort of fundamentally what this was all about, it's been interesting to get this far down the road and to still have that be fundamentally underneath it all what people are primarily concerned about. And as I head into this final term, I'm going to keep talking about that. I'm going to keep talking about my proposals for reforming state government, my proposals for getting people back to work, my proposals for creating a better tax climate for Massachusetts, my proposals for creating a better regulatory climate, and really focus on those issues that got me into this race in the first place, and I think are still the ones that are most important to most voters in Massachusetts, which is, what are we going to do to create a climate that can generate jobs and economic activity? Now, the other interesting piece about this is, this is not just a short-term problem for Massachusetts. This is a problem that has implications, has had implications over the last 10 years, and will have implications over the next 10 years. If you look at where Massachusetts was in 1998, when I left state government, there were about 3.2 million people working here. In 2008, even before the economy crashed, there were about 3.2 million people working here. Over a 10-year period of time, 1998 to 2008, Massachusetts generated exactly 0 net new jobs. You know, we added some jobs in some industries, but for every job we added, we lost one somewhere else. And over that 10-year period, we didn't add any new jobs to our economy on an overall basis. And the reason this is particularly problematic is one of the things that happens if you don't grow your economy, young people don't stay, okay? If you look at a lot of the demographic data for the last 10 years, you start to see this line where the 18 to 35-year-old population has started to decline, both as a percent of the total and in absolute terms. And this, you know, this is a big-time, long-term problem for Massachusetts. If we can't generate job growth on a net basis so that young people believe this is a place where they can plant their flag and make their life, then over time what happens is the state gets into one of these sort of negative spirals where we have fewer and fewer younger people, more and more older people as a percent of our total. And that blows away the whole notion about, you know, one generation passing on the opportunity to the next generation, which is what's been going on here forever and ever and ever. I mean, I live in Swampscott. I grew up in Needham, but I live in Swampscott. Swampscott has 14,000 people, okay? It's a small town. It's 3 square miles. It's a very small town, geographically. But many of the families that live in Swampscott have been there for 2 or 3 generations, 4 generations, okay? I mean, the names around town are very familiar to anybody. I mean, my wife and I have only lived there for 20 years, so we're sort of like, you know, it's like we just showed up yesterday compared to most of the folks who are there. But what's interesting about it is how many of these families have gone one generation after another. They still live in the community, or they live somewhere in the general vicinity. Grandparents get to see their kids, parents, as people grow up, they continue to be able to see their parents. It's the whole notion of one generation passing on to the next generation, and it's exactly the way it's supposed to work. And I worry a lot that if Massachusetts doesn't start to focus on creating jobs, on creating a climate for job growth, on getting jobs here and growing the businesses that are here, more and more of those young people, they aren't going to stay. And they're not going to leave because of the weather, and they're not going to leave because they want to. They're going to leave just because they have to. Because their job opportunity, their chance to make a life and make a living is somewhere else. And, you know, the simplest example of this is when the Red Sox play away. Okay? The Red Sox play in Baltimore, or Washington, or Tampa Bay, or Dallas, or Colorado. You ever notice how many Red Sox fans show up at those away games? The answer is a lot. Those aren't people who were born in those places who became Red Sox fans. Those are people who were born here, or somewhere around here, and sort of looked around one day and said, you know what? My future's somewhere else. And they left. And they set up shop in one of these other places, and they'll make a life, and they'll make a living there. But that's one more family, one more son or daughter, one more opportunity we had to create a life and make a life here in Massachusetts for somebody who didn't stay. And I got 3 kids. They're 19, 16, and 13. My oldest is a sophomore in college. I got a son who's a junior and a daughter who's in 8th grade. And I really want them to be able to make the same life in Massachusetts that I made, and that my brothers made, and that my parents made. But I fully expect that when they have to make that decision, it may not be here that they stay. They may decide to go to one of these other places because that's just where the best opportunity for them is. Because there won't necessarily be the kind of job opportunities here that I would like for them. And so I've said ever since I got into this race that if we truly want to create the kind of state, the kind of job environment where every generation has the same chance to pass on that opportunity to work and make a life and make a living to the next generation, we've got to get serious about fixing our cost of doing business, fixing our cost of government, and taking a far more aggressive approach to competing with other states for jobs and economic opportunity. I mean, this is a great state. I always thought that. The whole time I've lived here, it's a great state. But this past year and a half, I got completely outside my comfort zone. I ended up in all kinds of places I never would have ended up, talking to all kinds of people I never would have met otherwise, about all kinds of things. And it really is a state that's chock full of creative, talented, and innovative people doing amazing things. I mean, I was standing in a buffet line down in the southeastern part of the state, and I just turned around to the guy behind me and I said, "Hi, I'm Charlie Baker. I'm running for governor. You know, who are you?" And he told me, and I said, "What do you do for a living?" And he said, "I'm a beekeeper." And I said, "A beekeeper?" I said, "Did you major in that in college?" And he said, "No." I said, "It's a family business. It's like third generation, right?" He said, "It was started by my great-grandfather." I said, "Well, how big is it?" He said, "We have 20,000 hives." I said, "Well, I probably won't be doing a site visit there. That's a little too scary for me." And I said, "Do you make honey?" And he said, "No, we pollinate cranberries in the cranberry bogs." He said his dad knew a guy named A.D. Makepeace, who was the first person who figured out that you could flood the bogs, and cranberries float, by the way. If you don't learn anything else today, cranberries are one of the few fruits that float. Most other fruits, they sink, okay? Apples, bananas, grapes, they sink. Cranberries float. And this guy Makepeace figured out that if you flooded the bogs, right, where they had some cranberries, cranberries would rise to the top, you could clip them off the vines, and then round them up, turn them into juice. And he said, "The problem I got is I can't figure out how to grow the vines because you got water all around, you can't use pesticides or any of that kind of thing." And this guy's great-grandfather said, "Well, I got an idea. Maybe we could use bees to pollinate the cranberries." And so he basically grows the bees that every spring the cranberry people use to pollinate cranberry bogs. And they've been doing that now for 3 generations. And all I could think was, how many times when I've been traveling around the Commonwealth of Mass has somebody told me some story about some family business that started with some mom or dad who said, "I got an idea. And this is my idea." And there's so many businesses all over Massachusetts, small businesses of all kinds, that all started because somebody had an idea. And they worked that idea, and they worked it, and they figured it out, and they turned it into something. And then they passed it down to one generation, they passed it down to another, and they passed it down to another. And those are the businesses that make up a huge part of sort of the constantly changing face and nature of Massachusetts. A lot of those businesses, they're getting started here, but they're not scaling here now. They're going to other places. They're going to places that are cheaper, more affordable, and more competitive. Sometimes they go to New Hampshire, sometimes they go to North Carolina or South Carolina. Or sometimes they simply don't stay here, or they fail here. And if we truly want to be the kind of state that generates opportunity from one generation after another, we've got to compete. And that means we need to have competitive tax policy, competitive regulatory policy, competitive fiscal policy, and competitive business costs. And I've put a ton of proposals on the table over the course of this campaign to deal with all of those issues. Because for me, this is fundamentally about, are we going to grow jobs in Massachusetts? Are we going to create a Massachusetts where somebody who grows up here, plays by the rules, does the right thing, can get a job, can work here, make a life here, build a family? Or are we just going to kind of drift through the next 10 years and end up waking up one day and realizing, geez, a lot of those young people who used to stay, they're not here And I think it's a pretty clear choice, and that's what I think fundamentally the election's about. I don't think the governor believes we have as deep a problem as I believe we have. I think this is a fundamental structural issue that needs to be taken on aggressively over the course of the next 4 years. I don't think we can bunt our way to success on this one. I think this requires a far more aggressive approach to changing the way state government works and to coming up with different ways of delivering for people that the state delivers now. And I think in 11 days the voters get a chance to make a choice on this one. And I fully expect that they will make whatever the right choice is, because the people of Massachusetts are pretty smart, and having spent a lot of time getting to know them over the course of this past 15 months, I trust them. But I do believe there's a clear choice in this race. I think the governor thinks we're doing pretty well. He says all the time that we're doing the best we can. I think we need to do a lot better. And I think our focus, especially on being a lot more disciplined on the affordability side, on the tax side, on the regulatory side, on the job growth side, is just not there. And I believe with my background and my experience, having done 2 turnarounds, one with the Weld administration in the early 90s and one at Harvard Pilgrim, I think I've got some unique experiences and talents I can bring to this task. And the final thing I'd say, I don't have any interest in any other kind of office. I'm not a career politician. I don't think I'm ever going to be a career politician. I don't want to be an ambassador. I don't want to write a book. I'm not looking to leverage this to some other, position somewhere down the line. I'm fortunate enough to get elected governor. I'll serve for as long as the people of Massachusetts want me to, and then I'm going to go back and get a job and grow old here. But hopefully one of the things that will be a product of my time as governor is when my kids grow up and make a life and plant their flag, they'll be able to do it here, so that my wife and I will be getting in a car to go visit my grandchildren instead of having to climb on a plane. Thanks very much for the chance to be here. I'm happy to take questions on pretty much anything.